Hello again. It defines Israelis as Jewish. It downgraded Arabic and calls Jewish settlements a national value. A new law in Israel has been compared to the Nazi Germany Nuremberg race laws. It also drew tens of thousands of people onto the streets of Tel Aviv on Saturday, protesting its very existence. What will be the impact of the nation-state law on human rights in Gaza? Where do South Africans fit into this dialogue? To discuss this, we're joined by Eddie Makue, Parliamentary Chairperson of the Select Committee on International Relations and Trade. With me here in the studio, Kwara Kekana of Boycott Divestment and Sanctions in South Africa, and also Benji Shulman of the South African Zionist Federation. Welcome to all three of you. I'm going to start off with you, Eddie Makue. What is South Africa's position on Israel's new nation-state law?
South Africa has always builded on the legacy of Madiba and also the experience that we have gone through as South Africans, that we know that anything that is racial is not good. And what should happen is that in order to be a civilized nation, it is going to be important that we do away with any form of discrimination, and racial discrimination is a key element of what we cannot tolerate in any part of the world.
And you couldn't get more racial than this law, could you?
I doubt it very much, because it's such a blatant law, quite clearly defining people based on their origins as a people and also on the language that they're speaking.
Right. What sort of impact do you think it'll have on Israel and Palestine? And you've spoken out against it, but what will you do about it?
It is only going to worsen the possibilities for reconciliation and for the two-state solution that not only we as South Africans are promoting, but also the United Nations.
Is there still a possibility of a two-state solution?
We are hoping. We would have never thought that as a country that lived under apartheid ourselves, we would be able to make the gains that we have, culminating in the changes that happened in 1994. We have learned not to give up, but to always have hope, both as people of faith, but also as people who believe in the impossible to happen, because we are human beings. We make mistakes, and we as human beings can also correct the mistakes that we have made.
Okay, and can you make what appears to be impossible? Can you make it happen? I mean, South Africa is hosting Hamas here. Could South Africa use its experience, the ANC use its experience of operating outside of the borders to try and get a dialogue happening between Hamas and Israel? Because Hamas has suggested that they are open to it.
Well, I don't think that the conversations between Hamas and Israel is against the Palestinian
it's a start,
authority,
isn't it?
That is an elected authority, and Hamas is but only one component of that. And we believe that the role that the United Nations is playing is a very important one. Thus, as South Africa, we are siding with those in the United Nations, and that is what gives us hope for the future.
Let me ask you something, and then I'm going to let you go. South Africa withdrew their ambassador from Israel. Not sure if he's going to go back. Where did that leave South Africa's relationship with Israel, which used to be incredibly strong?
Well, we need to ask, what did it help when our ambassador was in Israel? It didn't help much. The brutal attacks against the people of Palestine, the occupation of their land, as well as the killing of innocent children, continue to happen. And we needed to demonstrate as a country our rejection of what was happening there. And that's the attention that we wish to draw when we decided that we can no longer retain the presence of a South African ambassador in such an unjust and apartheid-driven state like that of Israel.
Okay, Eddie Makue, thank you very much. Good to talk to you. Now, tens of thousands of Israelis took to the streets to protest the controversial Jewish nation-state law. Protesters are calling the law racist.
أنا موجودة بالأساس علشان نتظاهر ضد سن قانون أساس اللي هو قانون أساس القومية، قانون أساس دولة إسرائيل، دولة الشعب اليهودي. عشان نقول إنه هذا قانون هو قانون عنصري، هو قانون أبارتهايد. قانون اللي بيقول إنه في نوعين من المواطنين في هاي الدولة، مواطنين درجة أولى اللي عندهم حقوق واللي هن محميين تحت الدستور، ومواطنين درجة ثانية اللي ممكن تعطيهم حقوق كأفراد لكن هن كقومية كتعريف قومي هن ما لهم ولا أي حق.
Mr. Shulman, why do you think Israel felt compelled to have that law, to bring it about?
So I think we don't have to buy into the hype around this, right? If you look at Israel's equivalent of a Bill of Rights, it defines the country as a democratic state, it defines the country as an equal state, and the Jewish state aspect is actually a UN definition that the UN uses to describe Israel. No one seems to have a problem with the way the UN does it.
No, we're talking about this law, though.
But all this law did was take the UN definition and put it into the Israeli constitution alongside the other Bill of Rights laws. And it was a very long process. It was 7 years worth of talking to people. And obviously, anytime we do constitution making, we have experience in our own country.
It's pure racist hierarchy, isn't it? I mean, it puts Jews at the top.
There's nothing in this law that does anything to the rights of Israel's non-Jewish citizens. Everyone retains the equal rights. If you go to Israel right now, people are in the same schools together, they're in the same universities, they're in the army together on the Supreme Court. So this law just simply defines what the UN said Israel was 70 years ago. So I don't think that there's any sort of problem with that. And
I'm sure you have a totally different definition of the law, and the fact that they are, if you're not Jewish, they're Israeli, that you're a second-class citizen.
Definitely.
And treated as such.
It's quite problematic. And I think what you're saying earlier, Jane, you're quite correct that it doesn't get any more clearer than this. The fact that you have a state that unambiguously defines itself as a Jewish state and it exclusively, privileges one group over the other, it's very problematic. It's very racist. And what Israel effectively has done is declared itself an apartheid state. And I think what Reverend Eddie Makue was saying as well, that, in the context of our own history in this country, the fact that you have one rights for one group and another rights for one group, and it's what you're saying in terms of hierarchy of rights. You really have Jewish people at the top. This despite the fact that 1 in 5 Israeli citizens are non-Jewish Palestinians, indigenous Palestinians for that matter. So what happens to them?
And they've always complained about their lack of rights and the fact that this will get even worse. I mean, the fact that they are enshrining the right for settlements which are illegal under international law.
So all the law does is talk about settlement within Israel. It's got nothing to do with other places. I think that people are making a huge amount of issue out of this. Right? We have the Islamic Republic of Iran. England actually defines itself as a Christian state. There's no problem with those rights.
We're talking about Israel now. We're talking about the increasingly racist laws that have been introduced.
And I'm saying that if you define those laws as racist, then you would define England as racist, you would define France as racist, you would define Croatia as racist. There's no problem in the world with 32-odd Christian countries and 42-odd Arab states, Islamic states. That's their own self-definition. The difference, of course, with Israel is that it also has the Jewish and democratic and equal status, and the citizens in Israel are exactly that. They're free, they're democratic, and they go about their business quite happily, and anyone who goes to Israel will see for themselves.
As free as those living in Gaza.
I think the one thing is, you're raising a key issue earlier on in terms of, Palestinian citizens who are living in Israel have been raising this issue quite often. And you have over 50 laws that continue to discriminate them. And what this law essentially has done is essentially have said that you are second-class citizens, and the law now is in place to make sure that you remain second-class citizens. The fact that you have separate road systems, the fact that you have different education systems for different people. So effectively, Israel is then saying that you are effectively second-class citizens, and we've not just codified this into law.
I think it's a fascinating question. You asked about Gaza, right? Gaza is run by Hamas. Hamas is effectively similar to Boko Haram. It's an extremist organization. It defines itself as Islamic, right? And no one has a problem with what Hamas is doing and its extremist actions against Israel. If you want to talk about Gaza, you need to talk about freeing Gaza from Hamas. That is the crucial thing, and making it more democratic like Israel is.
But Israel feeds into the Hamas machine because Gaza is under siege. You cannot leave Gaza if you want to.
The only reason that Israel has a very legal blockade, international law has said that it's completely legal, is because Gaza uses the money that's given to it by the international community to fire rockets at civilians, kidnap children, exactly the way Boko Haram does. Okay? No one would seriously suggest that dealing with a security issue like Hamas is in any way discriminatory. Israel, if we were being shot at with rockets in the studio by Lesotho, I would very much hope that the South African government would send in the army, as it has done in previous occasions, to deal with that problem. And I think that that's entirely consistent with a democratic state that protects all of its citizens, because non-Jewish Israelis get killed by Hamas all the time.
I mean, Gaza feels that they're under siege. I know that Israel feels that its security is implicated with having Hamas on its doorstep. But if you look at what's happening in Gaza, the fact that people can't get out, they have very little reason to live, many of them. They leave their universities and there's no place to go. If they feel that they are being bombarded by their neighbor, what alternative do they have?
And I think you're raising a pertinent question. Look, the main question we should be asking ourselves here is what is the root cause of the problem? What is at the heart of the problem? And that is settler colonialism, occupation, and apartheid. And those that living in the Palestinian Gaza Strip, but also the occupied Palestinian territories, broadly those in the West Bank, for example, continue to live under brutal Israeli occupation that strips them of their dignity every single day. And what Palestinians have said, that as one of the ways in which to assist them, similar to what happened in the 80s when the South African liberation movements called on the international community for help. And this was through an isolation campaign. And similar to what Palestinians have done in 2005, they've called on for a campaign, an nonviolent strategy, Jane, to isolate Israel because of its policy of apartheid, using boycott campaigns, divestment campaigns, and sanctions campaigns. It's rooted in international law. It's a nonviolent strategy that is also a tested tool of resistance. And that's what Palestinians are asking of the international community.
And that's what you advocate. Tell us how it works.
So basically, I mean, when you look at the boycott aspect of the BDS campaign, this is about a cultural boycott campaign, getting those within the creatives industry not to perform or lend their voices in Israel. And we're seeing this growing campaign as well, those in academia as well. And we also look at the fact that Israeli academic institutions, for example, are one of the strongest and the key institutions in terms of the ideological support that it provides to the Israeli machinery and ideology of apartheid. Of course, divestments talks about the fact that calling on companies or corporations that are finding themselves complicit in the Israeli occupation of Palestine, multinational corporations like G4S, the security company, Veolia, Hewlett-Packard, you name them. And these are similar tactics and approaches that were quite employed in the 80s. For example, you had Polaroid that provided films for the Donbasses. And the activists in the 80s really said, you know, you can't find yourself complicit. So either withdraw from South Africa or really face the full might of the activists at the time, you know?
And what sort of impact is that having on Israel and the different types of activism that we've seen?
So basically non-existent, right? There really hasn't been much effect, because I think many people understand that largely this is driven by a campaign of hate. Right? In Gaza, for example, Hamas is very clear. It wants Israel wiped off the planet, and no amount of boycotting is going to do that. I think you really actually hit on what the international community should be doing. You spoke about South Africa's involvement with bringing people together. And I think that that's actually a really powerful example. As South Africans, we understand what it means to have people on different sides of the fence. There is a conflict there, right? People are fighting, they are dying, and we want to see less of that, not more of that.
Many innocent people on the Palestinian side.
Many innocent Israelis, right? Just this week, Hamas fired a rocket and nearly killed a toddler in an Israeli school. So we have to dumb down on the deaths.
Yeah, and a woman and a kid, and the kid and a baby.
Right, and this is exactly it, right? We don't want to see a continuous. We don't want to see continued civilian deaths. So how do we get people to sit down, to drop the extremist ideology that we're seeing, and as South Africans play a constructive role in helping bring the two sides together, which, by the way, is our foreign policy. We do it with Zimbabwe, Congo, all sorts of places.
I'm going to come back to that. We've got Mr. Martins on the line from the Val. Go ahead, Mr. Martins.
Good day, Jane. I am a Christian, so I am for Israel. And I don't see what is the difference between Russia saying Russia is for Russians, England is for the English, Germany is for the Germans, and in any case, that was declared 70 years ago, or over 70 years ago. Actually, it started way in the early, late 1900s, where England started to acknowledge that Israel was supposed to have a state of their own. So as far as I'm concerned, there is nothing wrong, because the Arabs are not going to allow the Israelites there.
I know, but the Palestinians were actually there before.
For me,
yeah, they were kicked off their land. Anyway, I mean, I don't even know where to begin to answer that question. Maybe you can answer that.
I mean, the one thing
is English, you know, for the English people, South Africans, just for South Africans, whatever they are.
And one thing, Jane, what's important is that if Israel is to exist, it can't do that at the expense of an indigenous population. That's the fundamental problem here. Settler colonialism is a problem. Occupation is a problem. Ethnic cleansing of Palestinians that took place in 1948, that's also part of the problem. So, Jane, if you want you and I to coexist, you can't exist at my expense. I mean, it's quite a simplistic example, but I think that's the fundamental problem here. If Israel is to exist, it can't do that at the expense of an indigenous Palestinian population that has continued to be there.
All right. So, I mean, clearly the two sides need to talk. And I'm just wondering if this law comes in at a time where people are beginning to realize that possibly a two-state solution is no longer an option.
Look, I think that the kind of rhetoric that we're hearing from groups like BDS shows you exactly why people are losing hope. The Jews are the indigenous people of that area. There's Jewish people that have lived there for 3,000 years. And unless you're prepared to accept the rights of the Jews to live there next to the Palestinians and find a way to have a solution, we're not going to have it. And it doesn't help to have people firing rockets into civilian areas.
Why don't you remove yourselves from the West Bank, the occupied West Bank, and free Gaza?
Jane, I think it's a great idea. Let's look at 2005. Israel removed every single soldier that was in Gaza. They moved it to the internationally accepted border, and the Palestinians had the opportunity there to create a paradise for themselves. They used the humanitarian aid, and I've been there personally. You know, I've been to the border of those communities on the border of Israel, and you can see there where they've written "Death to the Jews" on the rockets that they're shooting at the people on the other side. Unless we can pull the extremism out of this debate and find ways for people to
how do you pull extremism out of this debate? Big word. When there is this continuing fighting happening, you know, you know, you look at, I think it was 2014, 11 Israelis were killed and several thousand Palestinians, and that feeds into what you are seeing as the growing anger against Israel.
So let me give you an example, right? There's a great organization that's called something like the Groups for Peace in the Middle East, and they've actually just gotten funding from the Americans to take another South African example. They took it directly from South Africa to talk about people-to-people engagement. We understand at the moment that the governments of the separate peoples are not talking to one another. We know. But what we learned from South African examples, that South Africans got together and we worked across the line and said, all right, you know, women, let's work together with women. People in the arts, let's work together with arts, so that we remove, literally that's what removes the extremism, what you were asking, and creates the human in one another that can then push the politicians to create the peace process. That, I think, is a much better solution than trying to push people into corners.
Let's just listen to this. A Palestinian youth say that they're feeling more hopeless as tensions get worse. Ahed Tamim famously kicked and punched an Israeli soldier. She was recently released from prison for the crime. Let's listen to what she says she learned from her time behind bars.
السجن علمني كتير شغلات. قدرت بالسجن أعرف الطريق الصحيح 100% حتى أوصل رسالة وطني يعني بالشكل الصحيح. يعني السجن علمني كيف أصبر وكيف إنه أكون بمجموعة. علمني إنه دائما أحب الحياة لأنه السجن الواحد وهو بالسجن بحس أبسط الأشياء قيمة.
You definitely get the feeling that the youth, the Palestinian youth, are grouping, regrouping and finding a strength amongst themselves and each other. Is that going to work for them? I mean, how can they vent their frustrations?
I mean, the one thing is resistance is always important, and people like Ahmed Tamimi, who've become a symbol of resistance and strength, especially for the Palestinian youth, is quite important. And it's people like Benji that would have you believe that, you know, tactics like BDS and isolation campaigns don't work and they're ineffective, which is completely false. The one thing is, the main question would be, why would Israel, the regime itself, a state, establish a special ministry for fighting and combating international BDS initiatives globally? Why would you appoint a special minister if BDS is so ineffective, you know, to fight and combat the efforts of the global BDS movement? But again, you know, Benji talks about the fact that there are many lessons we draw from the South African case, which is dialoguing. The one thing is discussions and dialoguing must not be divorced from justice. That's the one. But also the international BDS campaign doesn't say people mustn't have a conversation, while at the same time we impose a concrete non-violent campaign, you know, to boycott, divest and impose sanctions against Israel because of its policy of apartheid. And the BDS global campaign is proving to do this. We're seeing a lot of people within the creatives industry that are saying, wait a minute, there's a problem right here, you know. And you see also growing progressive Jewish organizations within Israel in the US, for example, that have joined the BDS campaign and saying what Israel is doing must not do it in our name as Jewish people.
Okay. Let's bring in Kosi from Johannesburg. Go for it, Kosi.
Hello, madam.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am. I have a question for the people who are against the Palestinian people, especially the Jewish community. I just want to ask, what did they learn from the Holocaust? Because the Holocaust was suppressed the Jewish people. Now, what is fun is that the very same people, the Israel people, are doing the same thing what Hitler has done to them, to the Palestinian people. Is that okay to them? Because they should learn that love is very important, and they should also learn that tolerance is very important. I find it very difficult to understand why are they doing the same thing that Hitler has done to them, to the Palestinian people.
Okay, thank you for that.
I think I battled to hear the caller a little bit there, but my sense was what do we learn about the Holocaust? And I think that we learned two things. First of all, that at all costs we have to create democratic societies like Israel where people can interact and have their rights upheld. That's number one. And number two, if someone says they're going to kill you, take them seriously. Hamas is very clear about that.
I think he was more asking, considering what Jewish people went through.
Yes, so that's what Jews understand. They understand that when somebody says that we're going to wipe you off the face of the earth, that it's not a joke, that they mean it. And Hamas is very clear about what it wants to do. And Israel is going to keep defending itself as long as that is the view, not just of groups like Hamas. It's the Syrians around them, the Iranians, Hezbollah. Israel is in a very tough neighborhood, and I think we need to, as the Bible would say, keep one hand on the plow and one hand on the spear, because if you can't grow engagement with your neighbors, you'll never win. But they have. I mean, Egypt has a peace treaty with Israel. Jordan has a peace treaty with Israel. It goes to show what dialogue can do, but I also don't think it would be good to be putting down your weapons, because that would be the end of the Jews.
Donald Trump, so he moved the embassy to Jerusalem, which obviously sparked off a lot of bloodshed. Was seen as being very unfortunate and an unfortunate provocative statement. Is the US then an honest broker if it is so involved with Israel, considering it vetoes everything at the United Nations Security Council? Or should Israel and the Palestinians be looking elsewhere?
I mean, the problematic move with that, number one, is that you're right. I mean, it's an act of provocation, but also an open act of aggression against the Palestinian people. Also in the context of the discussion of the two-state solution and what Jerusalem means for the Palestinian people. And you're right again that really the question is US now an honest broker where the peace negotiations are concerned? And again, I mean, I said earlier on in terms of negotiations and dialogue that must never be divorced from justice. So that move like that alone really signals the end, I think, to the US being an honest broker in these peace negotiations.
And sadly, both the Israelis and the Palestinians are victims here. But thank you both for talking to us. That was
Thank you so much.
Still ahead, is there hope for the NPA's independency? We'll tackle that topic next. This is Tonight with Jane Dutton.